It was one of those mornings that seemed to promise normalcy, a promise that in hindsight felt almost too perfect. The sun had just begun to peek over the horizon, casting a soft, golden glow that streamed through the half-drawn curtains. The familiar, comforting hum of the house was already starting the faint crackle of the coffee machine, the low murmur of the morning news on the television, and of course the rustling of my mom's slippers on the wooden floor as she moved around the kitchen. I had grown used to these early mornings. They were a part of the rhythm of our lives, comforting in their predictability. I had been awake for a while, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, not really asleep, not really awake, just caught in the hazy space between dreams and reality. The house was still and peaceful, as if the world outside was holding its breath, waiting for the day to truly begin. My mind wandered aimlessly, free from the stress of the day ahead. It was a rare moment of calm before the storm of responsibilities that would soon rush in. I could already hear my mom humming softly in the kitchen, a tune I couldn't quite place but that always seemed to fill the space around her with warmth. It was the kind of hum that made the world feel right, no matter how chaotic it might get. But something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, just a vague unease that crept into my mind. It was subtle, barely noticeable, a shift in the air that didn't belong. I had been hearing it for a while now, in the silence that wrapped around the house. Something felt different, something that I hadn't quite seen or understood yet. Maybe it was just the lingering grogginess of sleep, or maybe it was the strange stillness of the morning. But whatever it was, it settled over me like a shadow I couldn't shake. I slid out of bed and padded quietly down the hall, my feet meeting the cool wooden floors with a soft tap. The smell of freshly brewed coffee greeted me like an old friend, and I found myself drawn to the warmth of the kitchen, where my mom stood at the counter, her back to me. She was wearing one of her favorite old sweaters, the faded blue one that had seen better days but still held its place in her wardrobe, a sign of its long history in our home. She moved gracefully, effortlessly, no hurry, just a gentle, easy rhythm that I had always admired. The scent of the coffee, dark and rich, mixed with the faint fragrance of pancakes, or maybe it was waffles, I couldn't quite tell. The breakfast ritual was a comforting one. It was how our days always started. And yet, even as I stood there, something about the scene felt off. It was Max that first made me pause. Max, our golden retriever, was usually the first to greet me every morning. His exuberant tail wagging and eager leaps were a constant source of joy in our home. But today he was sitting unusually still, his back straight and his gaze fixed intently on my mom. His usual energy, the playful exuberance that defined him, was gone. Instead, he sat there, his eyes wide and focused, as if listening to something only he could hear. It was as if he understood something, a language or a gesture that was beyond me. I tried to brush it off, chalk it up to my sleepiness or the early hour, but a knot tightened in my stomach. Max was never this still unless something was wrong. I was used to the way he would hover around me in the mornings, wagging his tail as if demanding attention, eager for his daily dose of affection or a treat. But today he was different. It wasn't just his stillness that unsettled me. It was the way he looked at my mom. The way his eyes tracked her every movement, his gaze following her with a kind of knowing. I couldn't quite place it, but there was something undeniably strange about the way they interacted. I watched as she bent down to scratch behind his ears, her voice soft and gentle as she spoke to him in a low murmur. But it wasn't the usual baby talk we all used with our pets. No, this was something else. Something more intimate, more private. She wasn't speaking to him like she would to a dog. She wasn't asking for tricks or trying to get him to do something. She was speaking to him in a way that made it seem like they shared some kind of secret, something unspoken, something only the two of them understood. "Max," she whispered. A tone of affection in her voice that I hadn't heard before. "You're being a good boy, aren't you?" It wasn't the words themselves that bothered me, it was the way she said them. Her voice had a softness to it, but also a quiet urgency, as if there was something serious behind the conversation, something more than just affection for a dog. It was as though she was asking him to listen, to understand, to do something. Max, for his part, didn't just wag his tail or sit idly by. He was listening intently, his eyes fixed on her, his head tilted slightly as if he was processing every word. I shook my head, trying to clear the confusion that was starting to cloud my thoughts. Maybe I was overreacting. After all, My mom had always been a little quirky, a little eccentric. She was the type of person who would hum to herself as she went about her day, who would laugh to herself at an inside joke, or speak in strange tones to the dog or the plants as if they could understand her. But this was different. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. The moment passed, but the unease lingered. I walked into the kitchen, trying to act normal, trying to push away the strange feeling that had taken root. My mom smiled as I entered, her face lighting up as she offered me a cup of coffee. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said, her voice warm and familiar. It was the same voice she always used in the mornings, the same smile that had been my comfort for as long as I could remember. But even in that moment, as I took the cup from her hands, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. There was an undercurrent of tension in the air, something that I couldn't name. "Morning," I replied, my voice coming out softer than usual. I noticed Max hadn't moved from his spot on the floor. He was still staring at my mom with that same unsettling gaze, his body perfectly still, not even the slightest twitch of his tail. I sat down at the table, trying to focus on the familiar rhythm of the morning. My mom busied herself with the pancakes, humming a little tune as she worked, while Max remained at her side. But there was an odd silence between us, a gap in the conversation, as if something important had been left unsaid. I kept stealing glances at Max, trying to make sense of his behavior, trying to understand what was going on, what was happening between him and my mom. My mind raced as I tried to puzzle it out. The odd behavior, the way Max had been acting, the strange whispering, and the unsettling tension that had settled over the house, what was it all leading to? And why did it feel like I was the only one who wasn't in on whatever secret was unfolding in front of me? The morning passed, but the unease didn't lift. In fact, it only deepened, and with it my curiosity. Something was definitely going on between my mom and Max, something that went far beyond a simple trick or a special bond between pet and owner. I had to know what it was. But no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I couldn't escape the feeling that my world was about to change forever. The world outside the kitchen window seemed so ordinary, so peaceful. But inside, something was shifting, and I was beginning to realize that I might be the last to know what it was. That day, as the sun rose higher in the sky and the world outside continued to move on, I felt the first stirrings of a mystery that would unravel everything I thought I knew. It had started out like any other day. But by the time evening came, I would see my mom, Max, and the life I thought I understood in an entirely new light. And it all began with that strange, unspoken bond between my mom and the dog. The days following that strange morning were unsettling, each one a slow descent into confusion. At first, I tried to dismiss it. I had a tendency to overthink, to find patterns where there were none. Maybe I had imagined the odd tension in the air, the way Max had stared at my mom with those wide, unblinking eyes. But as the days went by, I began to notice more things, little details that, taken together, couldn't be ignored. The bond between Max and my mom, which had always seemed natural, comforting, even began to feel different. It was as though there were secrets woven into their interactions, things left unspoken but never unobserved. Every morning when I awoke, the house seemed quieter than usual. The usual background noises, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the rhythmic tap of my mom's slippers as she moved through the house were muted, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Max, too, had changed. He wasn't the exuberant dog I'd grown up with, bounding with energy, desperate for attention. Instead, he had become more distant, almost watchful, his eyes always following my mom with a level of intensity I had never seen before. His movements were deliberate, slow, as if he were carefully calculating every step, every glance. And my mom, she had started to change too. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I began to notice the way she looked at Max. There was an intimacy in her gaze, a softness in her voice when she spoke to him that I had never heard before. She would call his name in a tone I couldn't quite place, part affection, part command, but always with an undertone of something else. She never raised her voice. There was no need. Max, it seemed, was always perfectly attuned to her every word, her every gesture, as though they were engaged in some unspoken conversation that transcended the ordinary bounds of language. It was one of those mornings, about a week after that unsettling day, that the full weight of the strangeness hit me. I had stayed up late the night before, lost in the haze of my thoughts, replaying everything I had seen, everything I had felt. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I felt a creeping suspicion that something was unfolding in front of me, something that I wasn't yet ready to understand. I had tried talking to my mom about it, but every time I opened my mouth, the words didn't feel right. I didn't know how to explain the discomfort, the way the air felt thick, heavy with something unsaid. So I kept my distance, watching, waiting for a moment of clarity. The morning sun filtered through the curtains as I rose, moving with a sluggishness that came from too little sleep and too much unease. As I entered the kitchen, the familiar sight of my mom standing by the counter greeted me, her back to me as she made breakfast. The smell of pancakes filled the air, and I could almost taste the sweetness of syrup, the warmth of freshly brewed coffee. It should have been a comforting scene, but it wasn't. There was something about it, something hidden beneath the surface of the ordinary, that gnawed at me. Max was sitting near the kitchen door, staring intently at my mom. His posture was rigid, alert, his tail held straight behind him. The silence between them was palpable, a thick layer that neither of them seemed willing to break. My mom, for her part, moved with the same quiet grace she always did. But today there was something different about her, she seemed. Distant. There was no smile on her face, no easy warmth in her movements. She was focused, almost intent on something that I couldn't see. "Good morning," I muttered, trying to make my presence known, hoping for a response, something that would reassure me that everything was normal. She turned, offering me a brief smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Morning," she replied softly, almost distractedly, her gaze flicking briefly to Max before returning to the stove. I tried not to notice the way she hesitated before answering, or how her eyes lingered on the dog for just a moment longer than they should have. I sat down at the table, my eyes following the exchange between them, trying to make sense of the growing tension. Max didn't look at me. His eyes remained fixed on my mom, his entire focus trained on her. It was almost as if he were waiting for her to make the next move, waiting for some signal that I couldn't understand. There was no wagging of his tail, no playful bark. He was completely still, as though frozen in place, watching her every move with a kind of intense scrutiny. And my mom, she didn't seem to mind. In fact, it was as though she welcomed his attention, as though it was part of some silent agreement between them. I tried to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. I didn't want to believe that there was something sinister in their connection. But as the days wore on, the subtle changes became harder to ignore. I began to hear strange things at night. It was faint, just a whisper, but it was always their soft murmurs, low voices that seemed to come from the kitchen or from the hallway just outside my room. I would lie in bed, listening, my heart pounding in my chest, wondering if I was imagining it. But the sound was always the same, a quiet conversation, too hushed to make out the words, but unmistakable in its intimacy. It was always her voice, the same quiet murmur I had heard in the mornings, speaking to Max as though they were two old friends sharing secrets. One evening I decided to confront it head on. After dinner, when my mom and I were alone in the living room, I tried to bring it up. "Mom," I began, my voice tentative, "I've been meaning to ask. Has Max been acting a little strange lately?" She looked at me, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she had expected the question. Her expression softened, but there was a guarded look in her gaze, a flicker of something I couldn't place. "Strange," she repeated. "What do you mean?" I shifted in my seat, feeling the weight of her gaze. "I don't know, just different. He's been kind of distant lately. And he seems so focused on you, like he's waiting for something. It's hard to explain, but..." "Max is just being Max," she interrupted, her tone a little too sharp, a little too quick. "You're overthinking it, sweetheart. He's a dog. You know how they are." I swallowed hard, not sure how to respond. Her words didn't soothe me. In fact, they made the unease in my stomach grow. I wasn't sure what I was expecting her to say, but the way she dismissed my concerns felt wrong. It was as though she knew more than she was willing to share, as though there was a secret she wasn't ready to let me in on. I had seen this before, this wall she would put up when she didn't want to talk about something, when she wanted to avoid a conversation. But there was something about it now, something different about the way she deflected my questions. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something from me. That night, after she had gone to bed, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, my mind spinning with questions I couldn't answer. The shadows in the room seemed darker, more oppressive, and the whispers from the kitchen echoed in my mind. I couldn't ignore it anymore. There was something going on between Max and my mom, something that I didn't understand, and it was beginning to terrify me. I finally got up, too restless to lie in bed any longer. I crept down the hallway, past the darkened rooms, to the kitchen. The house was eerily quiet, but the air felt thick with the weight of secrets. When I reached the kitchen, I froze. There, in the dim light of the fridge, I saw them. My mom was standing with her back to me, her head bent low, speaking in hushed tones to Max. The dog was sitting at her feet, his eyes locked on hers, his posture perfectly still. The scene was strange, almost ritualistic. It was as though they were in the middle of some private, sacred moment that I was not meant to witness. I stood there, hidden in the shadows, watching them. My heart raced, and for the first time in my life, I felt like an intruder in my own home. And then, I heard it. My mom's voice, low and deliberate. "You know what to do, Max. We've been preparing for this moment for so long. It's time." Max's eyes never left hers, and for a moment I swore that I saw something flicker in them, something almost knowing. The moment stretched out, unbearable in its silence. I wanted to run, to call out to her, to demand answers. But my legs were frozen, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't organize. What was happening? What was this bond between her and the dog? And why did it feel like I was standing on the edge of something far more terrifying than I could comprehend? The answer, I knew, was just out of reach. But it was coming, and I was beginning to realize that I was about to find out. It was the kind of evening that felt like it could go either way, dull and predictable or charged with something unexplainable. The kind of evening where the air is thick with a tension that you can't quite name, but you feel it all the same, lurking in the corners of your mind, waiting to emerge. The living room was bathed in the soft glow of the lamps, their yellow light flickering like tiny, frail beacons in the quiet of the house. The evening had settled in peacefully enough, with nothing out of the ordinary: the hum of the refrigerator, the clink of a spoon in a coffee cup, the soft rustle of pages as my mom read a book in her favorite chair. Max, too, seemed unremarkable. He had been unusually quiet all evening, lying on the floor near the fireplace, his eyes closed, his body still. I had grown accustomed to his ever-watchful nature, his quiet intensity, but tonight, even that seemed to have softened. He appeared almost absent, as if his mind were somewhere else. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something I wasn't prepared for. It started subtly, the change in the atmosphere. At first, it was barely noticeable. A sudden shift in the air, a slight change in the way the shadows moved across the walls. Then, as if the room itself had decided to hold its breath, the sound of the clock ticking became louder, more pronounced, like the seconds were stretching out, becoming heavier with each passing moment. I was sitting on the couch, absent-mindedly flipping through a magazine, trying to ignore the unease building in my chest. My mom sat across from me, engrossed in her book. She hadn't spoken much today, no more than necessary words. There was something about her, some kind of distance that had crept into her demeanor over the past few days. It wasn't like her, and it unsettled me. The strange thing, though, was that Max seemed to sense it too. It wasn't just that he had gone quiet, he had become unnaturally still. I watched him for a moment, my eyes narrowing in suspicion. His breathing was slow and even, almost mechanical. His chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, but there was no twitch of his ears, no shifting of his paws. He looked, locked in place, as if he were waiting for something. I glanced at my mom, but she was lost in the pages of her book, oblivious or pretending to be. I stood up, stretching my legs, and walked over to the window. The street outside was empty, the darkened houses lining the block like silent sentinels. No cars, no people. The world beyond the walls of our home felt distant, irrelevant, as if there was a barrier between what was happening inside and everything else. When I turned back to the room, something caught my eye: a movement, a flicker of change that came from Max. He was no longer lying still. He was standing now, his body tense, his gaze fixed on something I couldn't see. His eyes weren't looking at me or my mom, they were staring straight ahead into the far corner of the room, as if there were something there that only he could perceive. I froze, my heart starting to beat faster. The air in the room felt charged now, thick with something unspoken. I wanted to say something, to ask if my mom saw what I was seeing, but my throat went dry and no words came out. Instead, I just stood there, my eyes fixed on Max, my pulse quickening with every second. Then, without warning, Max took a step forward. It wasn't a lunge or a sudden movement, it was slow, deliberate, calculated, like he was moving towards something he had been waiting for. His paws made no sound on the wooden floor, his body barely shifting as he moved. He was so silent, so intent, that it almost felt like the room itself had become quieter to accommodate him. My mom didn't even glance up from her book. It was as though Max's movements were perfectly normal to her, as though this was something she had seen before. I couldn't understand it. Why wasn't she reacting? Why wasn't she acknowledging the strange energy in the room? Max's eyes remained locked on the corner of the room, and as he moved closer to it, I noticed something else. The shadows there were wrong. They weren't cast by any of the furniture or lamps. They were too deep, too thick, and they seemed to shift in a way that didn't make sense. It was like they were alive, breathing, pulsing with some kind of rhythm that didn't belong to the rest of the room. I felt my stomach churn. Something was happening, something I couldn't explain. The air felt heavy, suffocating almost, and the silence was unbearable. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to leave the room, to get out, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, watching as Max continued his slow advance toward the corner, his body rigid, his eyes unblinking. And then, without any warning, he stopped. His body went perfectly still, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze in place. Even the air around me felt as though it had paused, suspended in time. Max's eyes narrowed slightly, his muscles tensing as though he were preparing for something. I swallowed hard, taking a step back. I didn't know what I was expecting, but it wasn't what happened next. From the corner of the room, a low, vibrating hum began to fill the space. It was barely audible at first, like the distant buzz of a fly, but it grew louder, more insistent. My skin prickled, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. The sound seemed to emanate from the very walls, as though the room itself was alive, reacting to something hidden beneath its surface. The hum was so deep, so resonant, that I could feel it vibrating in my chest. It wasn't a sound I recognized, not one that belonged to anything natural. Max's body tensed even further, his fur standing on end. His eyes never left the corner, and the hum seemed to draw him in like a moth to a flame. I could see his muscles quivering, his breath shallow, but he didn't move. He stood there, utterly still, locked in place as if he were a part of the very fabric of the room. My heart was pounding now, my hands trembling as I reached out to grab the edge of the coffee table for support. I wanted to call out, to ask what was going on, but my voice wouldn't come. I felt as though something was pressing against my throat, choking off the words before they could form. And then, in that suspended moment, my mom's voice broke the silence. "Max," she said softly, almost whispering. Her tone was strange, gentle, but there was an underlying current of command in it. "It's time." I don't know what I expected her to say, but it wasn't that. There was something in her voice, something that sent a wave of cold through my veins. I turned to look at her, but her face was expressionless, her eyes focused on Max, as though nothing unusual was happening. There was no surprise in her demeanor, no concern, just that calm, unwavering focus. Max responded. He didn't bark or growl. Instead, he shifted slightly, tilting his head as though he understood exactly what she was saying. His body seemed to relax, but there was still that strange, almost otherworldly tension in the air. The hum from the corner continued, louder now, vibrating through the very walls of the house. It was a sound I couldn't escape, couldn't block out, no matter how hard I tried. Something was happening, and I couldn't deny it any longer. I wasn't sure if it was supernatural, if it was the product of my overactive imagination, or if something truly inexplicable was unfolding in front of me. But the room had changed. The air was thick with unspoken words, with a presence that was both unseen and deeply felt. I felt as though I was standing at the edge of some kind of revelation, but I wasn't ready to accept what it might be. Max stood at attention now, his eyes fixed on the corner. His tail was stiff, his body taut with anticipation. The humming continued, and I could feel my own breath catch in my throat. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all, but the more I tried, the less I understood. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The hum faded, almost as though it had never been there. The room returned to its previous stillness, and Max relaxed, his body softening. The air lost its charged quality, and the shadows returned to their normal shapes. Everything was as it had been before, almost. But I knew in that instant that something fundamental had changed. Something deep within the fabric of our home had shifted, and I couldn't explain it, couldn't grasp it fully. Max turned away from the corner, his eyes still unfocused, and walked slowly back toward his usual spot near the fireplace. He lay down, his body curling into a comfortable position as though nothing had happened. My mom never looked up. She simply turned the page of her book, as if the entire moment had been nothing more than a fleeting oddity. But I knew better. I had seen it with my own eyes. I felt a wave of nausea, a deep, gnawing sense of confusion, but also something darker, something that pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I wanted to speak, to demand answers, but the words were trapped in my throat. Whatever had just happened, whatever had just unfolded in that quiet, unsuspecting living room, was something that I wasn't yet ready to understand, and that terrified me more than anything. I was alone that afternoon, the quiet of the house thick with a strange sense of isolation that had settled over everything in recent days. My mom had gone out for errands, and Max was lying by the window, staring out at the empty street with an intensity that felt almost unnatural. The house seemed stiller than usual, as if it were waiting for something, though I couldn't say exactly what. I'd spent the morning idly wandering from room to room, unable to concentrate on anything for long. There were books on the shelf, but their spines didn't draw me in the way they once had. The television remote lay untouched on the coffee table. The half-empty mug of coffee I'd made earlier had grown cold, its surface dotted with the faintest film of cream. But something was pulling me toward the attic. I'd been avoiding it, not out of fear, but because it had become an unspoken territory I never fully explored. We all had our corners of the house we ignored, our memories buried beneath boxes and forgotten things. The attic door was just down the hall, tucked away behind an old wooden bookshelf that I'd grown accustomed to overlooking. I reached for the brass handle, feeling the coolness of the metal beneath my fingers. The door creaked open, releasing the familiar musty scent of old wood and dust that had never quite disappeared. It was a place of memories long past, untouched since I was a child. When I was younger, I would spend hours up here playing with old toys, digging through forgotten treasures that once belonged to my parents. But over the years, that sense of wonder faded, and the attic became just another forgotten part of the house. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I found myself climbing the stairs nonetheless, drawn to the dim light filtering through a small window at the far end. The air was thick, stagnant with the passage of time, and I felt a strange unease settle in my chest as I reached the top. There were old boxes everywhere, cardboard, wooden crates, things my mom had kept from years gone by. Each one seemed to hold the ghosts of a life I barely remembered, pieces of a time before I was fully aware of the world around me. I stood there for a moment, staring at the piles of junk, each one representing a memory I couldn't quite grasp. The attic felt suffocating, like it was holding on to secrets that had no business staying hidden any longer. The faint hum of the house's old wiring buzzed in the background, as though the house itself was whispering, urging me to look closer. And then, I saw it. A small wooden jewelry box, partially hidden behind a stack of dusty magazines. It wasn't much, just a simple thing. The kind of box that looked far more ordinary than it likely was. I crouched down and pulled it free, feeling a strange thrill run through me as I held it in my hands. The box was intricately carved with patterns I didn't recognize, delicate swirls and curving shapes that seemed both familiar and alien. It had the kind of worn patina that only comes with years of neglect. The clasp was slightly tarnished but still intact. My fingers brushed against it, the cool metal sending a shiver up my spine. For a moment I hesitated. I'd never seen this box before, not in my mom's things, not in any of the places I remembered from my childhood. It felt out of place. And yet there was something about it that drew me in, something that tugged at the deepest part of my curiosity. I couldn't resist. I opened the box. Inside, the contents were far more mundane than I expected, just a few old trinkets and bits of jewelry that seemed as though they had been forgotten for decades. A tarnished silver bracelet, a couple of beaded necklaces, a few rings that were too delicate to be of much value. But at the very bottom of the box, nestled carefully beneath the trinkets, was something else. A small black and white videotape, the label worn and nearly unreadable. I picked it up gingerly, my mind racing as I wondered why something so seemingly unimportant had been hidden away in such an inconspicuous place. The tape felt heavier than I expected, as though it held more than just images. I stared at it for a long moment, a mix of confusion and apprehension bubbling in my chest. What was this? What was on it? And why had it been placed so carefully beneath everything else? I didn't know why, but I had to watch it. It wasn't just curiosity, it was as if the tape itself was calling to me, its presence in the box a strange kind of invitation. I climbed down from the attic, the box and tape still clutched in my hands, and made my way to the living room, where the old VCR player sat, gathering dust in the corner of the room. It was an outdated relic, something I hadn't used in years, but it still worked. The tape slid into the machine with a familiar click, and I pressed play, my pulse quickening as the screen flickered to life. The footage was grainy, the image warping in and out of focus, but I could make out the figures of two people standing in a dimly lit room. One was my mom. She looked much younger, maybe in her early 30s, her hair shorter than I remembered, her face lit up with the kind of joy I rarely saw anymore. The other person was a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. They were laughing, talking, but their conversation was muffled, the sound distorting as the tape continued. I leaned forward, straining to hear the words. But then the image jerked, and for a moment the screen went black. My heart skipped a beat. Was that it? Had I missed something? The image returned suddenly, but this time it was different. The room had changed darker, colder. My mom and the man were sitting on a couch, their faces serious now, their voices low. There was a sense of urgency in the way they spoke, an unease that was palpable even through the grainy footage. My mom's face was pale, and the man's expression had shifted into something more guarded, more intense. He reached for something off screen, and when he turned back to face her, I saw what it was: a small silver necklace, delicate and beautiful, its chain shimmering in the dim light. My mom took it from him without hesitation, her hands trembling as she examined it. "I don't know if we should," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "This is too much." The man's eyes softened, and he reached for her hand. "We've already come this far. You can't go back now." The camera shook slightly, as if the person filming was moving, adjusting for a better angle. I could tell they were close to the action, so close that it felt almost intrusive, like I wasn't meant to be watching. There was something uncomfortable about it, something wrong, but I couldn't look away. My mom held the necklace in her palm, her fingers curling around it as though she were holding onto something precious and dangerous. The man's face softened, but there was something unreadable about him, a hardness in his gaze that made my skin crawl. "Promise me you'll keep it safe," he said, his voice low. "I will," my mom replied, her voice barely audible. The tape flickered again, and this time the image blurred so much that I couldn't make out the figures anymore. It was as though the tape itself were deteriorating, struggling to hold on to the memories it contained. The image froze for a moment, then began to roll back, reversing the footage until it was nothing but black and white static, the sound a distorted hum. My hand shook as I reached for the remote, stopping the tape and ejecting it from the VCR. The room seemed impossibly quiet. My mind was racing, filled with questions I wasn't ready to ask, with answers I couldn't yet process. The video was old, but it felt fresh, alive, as though it had been meant for me to find. The silver necklace, the look in my mom's eyes, the urgency in the man's voice, they were all things that felt too real, too close to the present. I didn't know who the man was, or why my mom had hidden this video, or what the necklace meant, but I felt it now. The weight of it pressed down on me and I couldn't escape it. I looked at Max, who had wandered into the living room and was sitting at my feet, his head tilted curiously, watching me with an unreadable expression. The silence stretched on, unbearable in its stillness. I didn't know what to do with what I had just seen, but one thing was certain: whatever this hidden video had uncovered, it was only the beginning of something much bigger, something that would force me to confront truths I wasn't ready to face. The sun had barely set when I found myself standing in front of the attic door once more, my heart pounding in my chest like a drumbeat, faster and harder with every passing second. It had been a few days since I discovered the mysterious video, since I first saw that strange exchange between my mom and the man I didn't recognize, and since I uncovered the unnerving silver necklace. The house had felt different ever since, darker, more oppressive, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And all the while, that unsettling feeling gnawed at me from within. I couldn't shake the feeling that there were answers hidden in this house, secrets buried deep beneath the surface, and the attic of all places was where they might be waiting for me. Max had been acting strangely ever since that night. He would pace around the house, staring into corners, growling softly under his breath, as if he sensed something was wrong long before I did. His once gentle nature had turned tense, almost watchful, and I couldn't help but feel a certain unease in the pit of my stomach whenever I saw him in those moments. The jewelry box, with its tarnished clasp and intricate carvings, sat on the living room table, still open, the necklace glinting ominously in the dim light. I hadn't dared touch it since that night, not wanting to draw too much attention to it, or perhaps because I feared what it might reveal. Every time I thought about it, my mind flashed back to the tape and the whispered conversation between my mom and the man. The weight of their words hung in the air around me, thickening the silence in the house, making it feel like I wasn't alone, even when I was. I had to go back up there. I had to find out more. Taking a deep breath, I turned the handle of the attic door and stepped inside. The familiar smell of dust and age filled my nostrils, but now it felt different. There was an oppressive air to it, a sense that thing long forgotten had been stirred and was waiting to be uncovered. The stairs creaked beneath my feet, groaning in protest as I ascended, but I didn't pause. I couldn't. I needed to know. I reached the top and stood in the dim light that filtered through the small window at the far end. The attic was just as I remembered, cluttered, chaotic, as though it were holding onto the detritus of 100 forgotten years. Boxes upon boxes of old clothes, forgotten photographs, family heirlooms, and knickknacks that didn't belong anywhere else. Some were covered in thick layers of dust, others looked as though they hadn't been disturbed in decades. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of mothballs and old wood. But today it felt different, more oppressive. I could sense it in the way the air seemed to press against me, like the house was watching, waiting, just as I had been. I had no idea what I was looking for, but I felt the need to search urgently, recklessly. The silence in the attic was stifling, and yet, it was louder than anything I'd ever known. I began to sift through the boxes, my hands trembling slightly as I pushed aside old blankets and yellowed papers. A few photographs slid free from the stack, and I glanced at them quickly, recognizing faces I hadn't thought about in years. My grandparents. My mom, much younger, standing beside my father. They were happy then, alive in a way that felt almost foreign. But there was something unsettling about their smiles, something that made the images seem less like memories and more like echoes of people I didn't fully understand. I shoved the photos back into the box and moved on. Hours passed in a blur of dust and shadows, the silence of the attic closing in on me with each passing minute. I began to lose track of time, my mind consumed with the singular thought of what I was searching for. Every so often I would hear Max's soft whine from downstairs, but his presence was distant, like a reminder that I wasn't completely alone. I could feel his eyes on me from below, watching me, sensing my unease. And then, it happened. I had reached the farthest corner of the attic, the one I hadn't explored before. It was darker here, the light from the window barely reaching the shelves in the back. As I began moving some old crates aside, I felt something hard beneath my fingers. At first, I thought it was just another forgotten box, but as I pulled it into the light, I realized it was different. This one was smaller, more compact, and made of wood that was far smoother than anything else in the attic. It was old, perhaps older than the house itself. Its surface was carved, not with the same intricate patterns I'd seen on the jewelry box, but with something much simpler, almost geometric. I didn't need to open it to know that it held something important. My hands shook as I pried open the lid. Inside, nestled carefully among scraps of paper and some old, brittle cloth, was a small object. A key. Not just any key, but a heavy, ornate key unlike anything I had ever seen before. The metal gleamed in the dim light, its surface covered in intricate engravings that seemed to shimmer as if they were alive, as though they held some deeper meaning. My fingers trembled as I lifted it out of the box, and for a moment I simply stared at it, the weight of it heavy in my palm. I had no idea what had opened, but the sense of dread that washed over me as I held it told me everything I needed to know. This key was part of something much larger, something I wasn't prepared for. But I knew with every fiber of my being that it was important, that I couldn't stop here. I needed to know what had opened, and more importantly, what it would reveal about the mystery that had begun to unravel around me. Without a second thought, I pocketed the key and began to scan the attic again, this time with a more focused intent. It was no longer just about rummaging through boxes and dusty old belongings. I had a goal now, a sense of purpose that pushed me forward, propelled me into the darkness of the attic's forgotten corners. As I dug deeper, my mind raced. What was this key for? What did it open? And why had it been hidden away in the attic, just as the video had been? Why did I find all of this now, when it seemed so much of the past had been buried for years? I searched through the remaining boxes, each one more disheartening than the last, but there was no sign of anything else that might hold an answer. There were no more keys, no more clues, just more forgotten relics and pieces of a life I barely understood. Frustration began to seep in, and I was just about to give up when something caught my eye. A small, rusted door set into the far wall of the attic, barely visible beneath a pile of old sheets. I hadn't noticed it before, hadn't even considered the possibility that there was another space hidden behind the clutter. My breath caught in my throat as I walked toward it, drawn to it with the same magnetic pull that had led me to the key. It was barely large enough to be a closet, but it had a lock, a strange, unfamiliar one, shaped to fit the ornate key I had found in the box. Without thinking, I knelt before it, inserted the key into the lock and turned. The mechanism clicked open with an unsettling finality. The door creaked as I pulled it wide, revealing a hidden room, a space that had been sealed off for who knows how long. Dust hung in the air, suspended in the weak light. But there was something else, a sense of something waiting, something hidden beneath the years of neglect. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The room was small, cramped, and cluttered with more forgotten things, but at the center of it all was a large wooden chest, ancient, covered in dust, and locked tightly. I didn't need to look at it for long to know that this was the final piece of the puzzle. This chest, whatever it contained, was the answer, the truth I had been searching for. And I was finally ready to open it. The chest was older than anything I had ever seen. Its wood was darkened with age, the grain worn smooth as though it had been caressed by time itself. The lock, though ancient, still held firm, a twisted iron design that looked like it belonged to a different era. It had no obvious keyhole, but the ornate, intricate carvings that adorned its surface seemed to hum with a strange energy. As I stood in front of it, holding the key, a feeling of foreboding washed over me. This chest, tucked away in the hidden room at the top of the house, had been waiting for this moment, waiting for me. I inserted the key into the lock, and it turned with an almost imperceptible click. A chill ran down my spine. My fingers trembled as I slowly lifted the lid, and as it creaked open, the musty scent of old leather, paper, and something else, something faintly metallic, wafted out to greet me. The room seemed to grow colder, and for a moment I was sure I could hear something whispering, just out of reach. Inside, the chest was filled with carefully organized bundles of papers. They were yellowed with age, their edges frayed as though they had been touched by countless hands over the years. Some of the pages were written in a language I didn't recognize, the ink faded but still legible. Others were covered in old, familiar symbols that seemed to pulse with an eerie light, as though they held secrets too dangerous to be known. But beneath the papers, there were more items, objects that were strangely familiar, yet utterly foreign. A collection of delicate jewelry, silver and gold, glimmering faintly in the dim light of the attic. An old, leather-bound journal, its spine cracked with age, as if it had been opened and closed 1,000 times. and at the very bottom of the chest, a small wooden box sealed with a wax insignia. I pulled the journal out first, feeling a shiver pass through me as I held it in my hands. It was older than anything else in the house, perhaps older than my family itself. The cover was embossed with a symbol I couldn't quite place, but it stirred something in me, something deep and unsettling. The moment I opened it, the room seemed to grow darker, the shadows stretching and pulling around me, as if the house itself was reacting to what I had uncovered. The pages of the journal were filled with entries in the same language I had seen on the other papers. They seemed like fragments of a larger story, each entry short but precise, as if the writer were trying to hide something that needed to be understood, but also feared. There were mentions of a family, my family, and a legacy that had been passed down through generations, a legacy that was shrouded in secrecy. The first few pages were mundane, describing everyday life, but as I flipped further, the tone shifted. The entries grew darker, more cryptic. There were warnings about hidden powers, about rituals that had been performed in secret, and about bloodlines that could never be broken. One entry in particular stood out, written in the trembling hand of the journal's author. The key is the first step, but it is only a beginning. What lies beyond must never be uncovered. The house holds the answers, but they come at a price. I felt my breath catch in my throat. The words seemed to bleed into my mind, leaving a bitter taste in my mouth. What had my family been involved in? What legacy had been passed down to me, and why had it been hidden for so long? I put the journal aside and reached for the small wooden box. My fingers brushed over the wax seal, and I could almost feel a pulse of energy radiating from it, like a heartbeat echoing through the air. Slowly, carefully, I broke the seal and lifted the lid. Inside was a necklace. Not just any necklace, but the same silver necklace I had found in the jewelry box days earlier, the one with the strange symbol. The same one that had felt so familiar, so wrong, the moment I laid eyes on it. It gleamed in the dim light, the metal twisting and turning like something alive. The pendant was shaped like a crescent moon, but there were markings etched into its surface that seemed to shift as I stared at them, as if they were rearranging themselves. I couldn't help myself. I reached for the necklace, my fingers brushing against the cold silver. The moment my skin made contact, a surge of energy shot through me, so intense that it left me breathless. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a dizzying pull deep within me, like I was being drawn into the very fabric of the necklace itself. I gasped and jerked my hand away, my pulse racing. My head spun, and I had to steady myself against the chest for a moment to regain my balance. The attic around me seemed to pulse with an unseen force, the shadows closing in as though they were alive. I could feel the weight of the house, of the legacy it held, pressing down on me, and I knew that I had only just begun to uncover the truth. My fingers trembled as I held the necklace in my hand, my mind racing with questions I could barely comprehend. What was this necklace? What did it mean? And why had it been hidden in this chest, buried beneath the layers of secrets and history? But before I could dive deeper into my thoughts, I heard a sound. A soft shuffle, a movement in the darkness. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't Max. No, this was something else. I turned around quickly, my heart thundering in my chest. But the room was empty. The attic was still, the shadows stretching longer with the fading light. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. A whisper brushed the edges of my mind, faint but unmistakable. You have opened the door. Now, you must walk through it. I froze, my blood running cold. The voice, no. The presence was everywhere and nowhere at once, wrapping itself around me, pulling me deeper into its grasp. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I wanted to run, to escape, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear myself away from the necklace, from the chest, from the revelation that I had stumbled upon something far darker than I had ever imagined. The whispers grew louder, filling the air around me, swirling in a dizzying chorus. My vision blurred, the edges of the room fading as if they were being consumed by shadows. I reached out instinctively, grabbing hold of the journal and clutching it to my chest. The pages, still warm from my touch, seemed to thrum with life as the whispers intensified and the darkness closed in. I was caught between two worlds, the world I had known, the world I had trusted, and the world that was unfolding before me. a world where secrets had been buried for generations. The weight of the legacy of the family that had come before me pressed down on me, and I realized with a sickening certainty that there was no going back. The truth had been unlocked, and now it was demanding to be heard. I stumbled backward, dropping the necklace into the chest as if it were a live wire, and slammed the lid shut. The whispers ceased abruptly, and the room fell into a suffocating silence. I was left standing there, panting, drenched in cold sweat, my mind reeling. I didn't know what I had just uncovered. I didn't know what I had just unleashed. But I knew one thing for sure: my family's legacy was far darker than I could ever have imagined. And it was not finished with me yet. The necklace, the journal, the chest, they were all pieces of a puzzle that I had only just begun to understand. And the more I learned, the more I realized how little I truly knew. I didn't know what I was walking into, but I knew one thing: I couldn't stop now. The truth was out there waiting for me, and it had already begun to pull me into its grip.